My name is Thibault Devienne. I'm 24 years old currently, and I'm a yellow vest in France. I've been involved into local politics since I was about 15 years old. I was working at the start of the movement as a teacher, private teacher, for disadvantaged kids, and I continued on in order to become a full-time yellow vest, also working as a part-time independent reporter now, in order to support the movement. It is since it started.
Can you tell us something about the arrival of President Macron and how that changed? I mean, it's great that you're, as a young man, you're getting involved in politics even at a young age. But what was it like to have Macron appear, and where did he come from?
So, it would be actually, it was said many times that Macron came from nowhere. That's not really quite the case. Actually, it was part. Despite the fact that he was labeled as brand new and such an original political product, that it was supposed to be bright and young and the future of French politics, he was actually part of Hollande's cabinet beforehand. He was the finance minister of France for quite a bit of time, really, before being laid off, in order to prepare truthfully what he had already planned as being his professional, top-notch presidential political career. It would be is not a beginner whatsoever regarding politics. He was advertised as such, of course, because after the god-awful 5 years of the previous President François Hollande, people wanted a change, and that change was advertised by the general medias in France, but in the Western world in general as the change. Emmanuel Macron, a young stud, coming from a non-political background that was supposed to turn France around. And despite the fact that French people had a bit of reluctancy buying that version of history, most doubted that, especially considering, the fact that he was part of François Hollande's cabinet. He got served by very persistent propaganda from these same medias that had already chosen him, that were faithful to him, and that advertised him. I think it was the subject of, like 1,800 articles in the small year that it took to prepare the presidential election. So it was really advertised, in order to gather a lot of votes, and that's eventually what happened. As some of you might know, the French presidential elections are in 2 rounds. What happened is he went on against a candidate, which is, of course, Marine Le Pen of the National Front. Marine Le Pen from the National Front isn't that popular in France, and, it's always the same tune in France. When the National Front comes into the second round, we know perfectly that no political party whatsoever is going to actually make an alliance with her. So the National Front, despite being the first political party, actually most French people didn't vote or choose not to vote during those elections. National Front comes second. Macron ends up against the National Front, but of course, because most people would rather, even despite not voting Macron during the second round, would better have him instead of the National Front, Macron got elected. I have to admit that I was not very impressed by that election, like most French people. We're talking about a guy that basically had, one of the lowest confidence rates coming into office during the Fifth Republic in France. Less than 5% of France's public opinion trusted him with a presidential with actually being fit for the post, despite him coming in as president, due to lack of, decisive aspect of the French presidential system. So I think Macron went on a bad start, from the start, actually, from getting into office. And he has just confirmed that negative aspect of his since he came into action 2 years ago, a bit less than 2 years ago, actually.
Okay, so, I mean, the Yellow Vest protests apparently started because of some kind of a fuel tax. Macron is imposing this because he is trying to bring France along the road of the low carbon country. Now, surely this is something which has been agreed in Paris and other places. Internationally, we need to bring down our emissions, and he's just simply doing what has been agreed internationally, and yet some people, like yourself in France, appear to have be saying, no, this is wrong, and we have to really break this agreement that has been made mostly around the Western world, because the Chinese are not playing ball here, to reduce the threat of pollution and climate change.
Okay, I understand your question. The thing is, I think it's quite clear that no one, I hope, at least in this world, and especially in France, stands against ecology. You know, we are, nationwide. Ecology stands as, the environment. The current situation with the environment is, of course, an important matter. Emmanuel Macron's stance on that subject, I think it is quite dubious, and I'm going to tell you why. The thing with Emmanuel Macron is that his so-called ecology bills seem to always fit with his agenda on imposing taxes on the French middle class. We're talking about someone who openly promotes an open society with, not only mass migration, but someone who sees, globalization, economic globalization as a positive thing. So we're going to have fruits, vegetables coming through naval structures, coming through our ports instead of being grown here in France. We're going to have huge sums of planes flying from and to France, which have basically virtually, which are not being taxed at all, thanks to EU's law, because of course Emmanuel Macron, unlike you guys in England, strongly believes in the EU. And at the same time, someone who promotes a so-called, environmental friendly agenda on imposing always the French middle class. This fuel tax, I understand the whole bit about, environmental friendly, one planet at all. This fuel tax was especially aimed at the French middle class in order to gather more taxes. So we're talking about a country where, for example, in Paris, if you have a car that dates back to, I think it's more than 15 years ago, you're not supposed to enter Paris because it's considered to be too not environmental and not pro-environment enough.
Okay, well, that is interesting. That's an interesting idea, isn't it? Because what they're then saying is that if you have an older car, in other words, maybe you don't have much money, you've had to buy it for a few £100 in English money, you have a cheaper car, then you can't come into Paris. But if you have a brand new car, maybe an enormous engine, whatever, then that's fine. You can come in. So this seems to be a regressive tax.
Well, that's actually okay with him. So that wasn't the tax promoted by Emmanuel Macron. Just an example, coming from his government, coming from his political party, coming from his political agenda. But that's the whole thing in France. It's nice to promote, of course, being environmentally friendly. It's nice to promote, warnings against climate change, and to use that agenda against other presidents, etc., like Mr. Trump. The thing is, there's not a single tax revenue. We're talking about someone who openly promotes maritime transport, seafood transport, even aeroplanes, etc., which do not pay as much taxes, despite being way more concerning regarding the environment. We're talking here about a tax that's going to affect everyone, because, of course, people in the big city, people in Paris, in Marseille, they can use public transport really easily. And they use it quite a lot in order to go to work, in order to move around in general, etc. People in, small cities, people in rural areas are not able to use these solutions. Plus, they are usually people with a much lower revenue. So it's not a matter of being environmental friendly or not. If to be a good green citizen, you have to buy a car that's gonna maybe cost 50,000 euros. Well, most French people, around 99% of French people, they can't afford that, of course. So, this only Macron uses this stance as an excuse to promote his economic agenda. Because of course, he's not gonna input taxes on, the social economic elite in France, which roots for him, votes for him, made him into what he is today. He was built from the start by this financial elite. He's a banker. He comes from the banking world, and like most political candidates in France or previous presidents who at least have a decency, to hide these ties with and their financial background. He doesn't. He was openly promoted as such, and so we're talking about a tax that's going to affect the worker in rural areas that has to go to work by car every day. That is not going to affect, of course, the people who could pay these taxes the most. The upper class in big cities.
What's happened in France? Because you're saying that Hollande was a disaster, Macron is a disaster. Is the Fifth Republic failing?
Well, the Fifth Republic has been failing for a long time. I think it's a complex question as well. A very complex question because we've been also, since President Mitterrand a bit more than 20 years ago now, the Fifth Republic, unfortunately, you can't blame everything on French institutions and the Fifth Republic. Those institutions worked perfectly when they were managed by very honorable men, like, of course, everybody now in France has, sees the Fifth Republic in a good view when it's de Gaulle, when it's Hollande, when it's recent presidents. It's a bit less evident, of course. I don't think the Fifth Republic is solely to blame. I think that the common stance that was taken by the political elite to go further down the path of the EU losing our sovereignty has a lot to do with it.
So, it sounds like you're implying that the yellow vests are anti-Brussels. Is that the case? Is that a formal position?
There are many positions with the Yellow Vest. I would believe, if you were to interact with most people within the Yellow Vest movement, most of them would be anti-Brussels, surely. It was not made official because, of course, the Yellow Vest is not an organized protest, as you might know. Everyone comes with his own specific, IDs and backgrounds. Of course, there are IDs that are more represented and that are more in line with what the moment is talking about and is hoping for.
Well, hang on, that's a problem though, isn't it? Because you've got to have some kind of alignment of demands. Otherwise, how can you achieve anything with the Yellow Vest protests?
So that's an interesting question because that has a lot to do with the start of the movement, what it started as. The Yellow Vest movement didn't start, unlike most, you hear about demonstrations in France all the time. That's one of the original aspects of the French Yellow Vest. It was born out of anger, it was born out of despair, it was born out of misery, and it started more as a global, let's say, protest without any specific political aims than, an organized movement with a leader, with a perspective, with a full-on program. And from this base, the Yellow Vest evolved, weeks after weeks, months after months, building sort of a list of things to obtain from the. Of course, one of the top, advanced ID is what's known in France as the wreak, which is the direct referendum from the people. We've been, last referendum to happen in France was in 2005. It was the French people stood against at the time. It was about the EU. The French people stood against the Rome meeting, and of course they were denied in 2008 by President Sarkozy, they were denied a decision despite them voting against it.
Okay, this is
President
the EU constitution, I think, isn't it? And then it's interesting because they framed it as the EU constitution, many countries had plebiscites on it, referenda on it, and then it came back again as something called the Lisbon Treaty, because a treaty doesn't have to have a referendum, even though actually the text of it was pretty much the same. So what happened in 2005? Was that result rejecting the constitution, was that just ignored by the government?
At the time, no, of course. The government had no choice, but to go with what the French people had decided. But as you mentioned, the Lisbon Treaty in 2000, which came in fruition in 2008, which is exactly the same treaty, and it's not me talking about it. Actually, previous French president Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, which was a founder of, one of the founders at least, of the European Parliament, said that on a national radio in France, and everybody went with it. So last time there was a referendum in France, my point is, last time there was one in France, it was completely denied. So one of the main remarks, one of the main wishes of these protests, Yellow Vest protests now, has been to implement into the constitution directly the possibility to have, the possibility to choose a law from the people, by the people, without going through parliament, without going through, because a few referendums that we indeed had in France were chosen by the government.
Well, I think so that might be something that people in Britain would recognise, because obviously we've had a bit of problem with the Parliament here ignoring the request from the Brexit referendum in the UK. Anyway, so yes. What about other demands? Because obviously that's one, but I mean, is there any kind of wider vision? Because this is one of the things which I know the French are actually quite good at, which is creating a united front to bring lots of people together under one banner. Now, have the Yellow Vests managed to achieve that, or is that still work in progress?
So, that's, we're talking about a movement that has 1 year of existence. Actually, we celebrated that birthday last Sunday. So we're talking about a rather young movement, of course, politically speaking, especially considering the fact that, unlike most political protests in the past, it wasn't the product of a specific political party. It wasn't the product of a workers' union or anything like that. It was a product purely of the people, not very politically educated people, might I add, and I'm part of that. I fit in that. The thing is, at first, the Yellow Vest movement was all about, kicking out Macron, the wreak. It was all under a common banner, and, you could find, and that was also one of the most refreshing aspects of these protests. You could find in these protests, people going alongside, getting together, talking about politics, etc., working together in order to achieve this goal of kicking Macron out, of achieving the wreak. You could find anarchists, you could find socialists, you could find people who had no political identity whatsoever. You could have people who voted for the National Front. You even had people who voted for Macron, as surprising as it sounds. So you would find it would be a sort of an amalgamation of every. It was a French, basically, to speak the truth. It didn't have anything to do with a special, policy or a special agenda. It was the French people revolting. So that was the situation, in maybe December last year, January last year. Since that, many political parties have tried, to infiltrate this purely non-partisan movements and turn it into something completely different. Of course, you have left-wing parties like what we call in France La France Insoumise, which is like extreme left-wing political party which got involved with the protest despite seeing it at first as some product of right-wing policies, which is kind of funny if you consider it. And every political party has tried to tear that apart, basically, and to change it into something that it's not. Meaning the left is going to say that, of course, the Yellow Vests, they root for, against global warming, against, for the proletariat, which is, of course, which has some truth in it. But at the same time, you're going to have, nationalists, right-wingers, which are going to say, yeah, it's all about immigration, etc. It's all about going against the EU. It's all about France's identity, which it is a bit as well. So, unfortunately, unity has been a bit shattered because of that, because of this constant involvement and constant work, underground work of these political parties and union workers.
I mean, it sounds. It sounds also like. It's almost there were attempts to undermine the movement by the opposition, which of course is trying to divide French society into rich and poor, feed the rich, starve the poor. They will not want this kind of thing to happen. I mean, there is a list which is 25 demands, including economy and work, politics, health and environment, foreign affairs. I'm just going to read out some of the demands. This is on signsofthetimes.net. That's www.sott.net. Has an article saying, this is from last year, actually, this time last year, saying this is a manifesto put out by some of the Yellow Vests. And I just want to see if you recognise it. A constitutional cap on taxes, 25%. An increase of 40% in the basic pension and social welfare. Increased hiring in the public sector. Massive construction projects to house 5 million homeless. Severe penalties for any cities that leave people on the streets. The breakup of the banks, too big to fail banks, to re-separate high street banking from casino banking and investment banking, and also cancelling debts accrued through high rates of interest. Now, I don't know if that's been agreed amongst all Yellow Vests, but it certainly would make sense to quite a lot of people reading it, saying, well, all that, would actually create a better country. So is that something you recognise, those demands?
Personally, on a personal level, I would agree with most of these demands, especially the one regarding the debt. The thing about those demands, and the thing that's a bit of an issue with the Yellow Vests in general, that we also need to tackle as Yellow Vests. Many committees were formed, many local, regional committees were formed, and of course they hold assemblies, in which the people get to talk, and in which they're gonna try to process through specific demands, etc., etc. The problem with the Yellow Vest movement is, and has always been the same, is that it is a tactic called leaderless resistance. And since it doesn't have a central committee, since it doesn't have a leader, since it doesn't have, broad political thinkers, the thing is you're going to get very various demands, some which most Yellow Vests would completely disagree on, some that most Yellow Vests would completely agree with, some demands that do not fit, of course, the reality of the global politics.
Okay, so the disadvantage of that is a bit disorganised, but the advantage is that the authorities cannot sort of take the head off the pyramid, because there is no head of the pyramid. So, look, going down to the brass tacks here, Thibault, there's been between something like 10 to 15 deaths over the last year. I mean, how has that happened? Because there's not been actually that much coverage in Britain. We're only, 10, 15 miles away across the channel. How have these deaths come about? Because surely the police have to police these protests in a way which doesn't lead to people dying.
So this is where also we're touching on a difficult subject. Of course, these numbers, they vary from, as you said, from 10 to 15. Some people count more, some people count less. It's hard to pin down a specific number. What's happening in France, and like in most countries in Europe, is that there are two aspects. The tactic that was given to the police and the traditional police tactics. So unlike most European countries, in France, when rioters happen to be within a protest where the police is going to try to arrest them, in France, a protest is treated as a mass. So the police is going to basically launched tear gas, shoots at the protesters. And when I say shoot, I mean literally, not with guns, but with the infamous RBDs, which are guns with rubber bullets, were actually condemned, I think, by the UN. That shouldn't be used in France, there are still. So the police force is going to see that protest as a mass. So despite the fact that you have very peaceful people going there, they are going to be faced with police brutality eventually if they can't move too fast. Because there is not this idea that, we need to take the rioters out. Of course, this is also part of a political agenda. And I have a very concrete example of that. Last week, we were having a demonstration in Paris, which I was, of course, part of, celebrating the 1 year in existence of the movement. Some rioters managed to come to these protests, despite the fact that most people, me included, had to go through several police checks before checking in. So this is where there's a bit of an incoherence. That protest became very violent very early on.
Okay, can you give us an idea of how many people were there?
It's hard to say how many people were in Paris because we got scattered very early due to this police force, due to these police tactics. I think there was more than 15,000 people in Paris, which is not a lot compared to the general French population, but of course, most people are afraid of going to these protests because of police violence.
So what happened when the rioters turned up?
Allow me to put the emphasis on the fact that there were several police checks, and yet some people were, got their water bottle confiscated, and at the same time, we're talking about people who are dressed fully in black, who can manage to go through these police checks without a wound, without getting arrested, without anything, and these people have, weapons. Some of them have weapons.
What sort of weapons? What sort of weapons?
So it's going to be crowbars. It's going to be tactical masks in order to avoid the gas, which I was denied one, and most people got denied one. It's going to be for the crowbars in order to, of course, take the pavement out and throw it at the police. So these kind of weapons. We're not talking about guns, of course, or some have some knives. I've seen that, and yet they, strolled through the police check. So this is a moment where we need to address the fact that Macron loves this kind of scene because, of course, it has several advantages. First off, it allows to take, really convincing pictures, really convincing videos showing that, yes, of course, these demonstrators, they are violent. They are the violent kind, and they fight against police. They, so you shouldn't go there. It serves as a basis to use that to his advantage in order also to divide the people, to give a bad image of the movements, despite the fact that it's still overwhelmingly popular in France and supported by the masses, quite frankly. The purpose of that is also that it allows Macron to disallow, to pronounce these demonstrations illegal. Last week, we had a legal demonstration, which you need to go through a complex process in order to validate the fact that these demonstrations are going to happen and that they're possible. One of my personal friends went to Paris in order to do this process, and this protest, this demonstration was completely legal. It was made illegal at the last second, 20 minutes beforehand precisely, and not a single policeman bothered to actually tell the people there that it has been made illegal and that they need to get out of there, unlike the normal procedure. Only the people who were responsible with this demonstration got the news that it had been made illegal, and of course, meaning that day, if you wanted to celebrate in legal, peaceful way the 1 year celebration of the movement and keep on fighting, you had no choice but to go to your place because there was no legal demonstration available in Paris. So we are talking about imagine a country, you have to in order to demonstrate against the government that you claim to fight, you have to first off validate the fact from you have to get the authorization from the government, from the prefecture, which goes hand in hand with Macron in order to fight against it. And at the last time, they're deleting that possibility of fighting it legally without violence. They're deleting that. So imagine if something like that would happen in Russia. Imagine for a second if something like that would happen in Poland. We would be talking about complete dictatorship. Yes, this is what's currently happening in France.
Well, I mean, it's worth remembering, Thibault, that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights does actually guarantee the civic right of assembly. This is one of the basic rights in the Universal Declaration, which was signed by all member states of the United Nations after the Second World War, really as a kind of lesson to try and make sure that the problems that led to the Second World War couldn't happen again. The right to peaceful assembly is really a very basic human right, but it sounds to me like that right doesn't exist in Paris.
And you are absolutely right. It does exist. And especially when we talk about France, we're talking about the country that is supposed to believe that to the core. If I remember correctly, Emmanuel Macron actually, when the crisis happened last year in Venezuela, said clearly that the people should have the right to demonstrate, yet is not doing that. Is doing the opposite in his own country in order to save himself. What they get you with in France, what actually happened to me on a number of occasions is that despite this supposedly universal rights, you're going to go to Paris, you're going to a protest, and if there's not a legal protest, which shouldn't be a thing, a legal protest, a protest is, if it's violent, is supposed to be legal. They're going to give you a fine, explaining that you're a threat to national security, and that's what happened to me on a number of occasions. So when talking about the yellow vests, we're talking about people which most of the time they don't have a lot of money. So that's also one of the tactics that the government is keen on using.
Okay, so how much do they fine you, Thibault?
So it's precisely 133 euros per time they are going to fine you. So I think I got 4 or 5 of these. So imagine just how much it costs in order to demonstrate.
So what exactly did you do to deserve those fines?
Well, I remember clearly the first time I had a French flag on my back, which apparently, without even a yellow vest. No, it's even more than that. It's even weirder than that. The first time I got caught, so to speak, by the police force, and they gave me a fine, I was with a friend walking near the Arc de Triomphe, going to a legal protest, protest that, that was organized and that had the authorization of the civil authorities. I was walking to get there, and I was stopped by a policeman who recognized me as being part of the yellow vest. I didn't have my yellow vest on, despite the fact that it would be completely legal to have so. And I was stopped, and even despite the fact that there were 2 of us going to this protest, we were fined because we were next to the Arc de Triomphe. 135 euros. And these cases, some of them are just absolutely ridiculous. But at the same time, that's their tactic. It's like, you want to protest against me? Okay, so let's go. So I'm going to put the police against you, which the police wouldn't supposed to be against us. They have tough living conditions as well. And despite the fact that we've got major issues with the police, they have tough living conditions as well. It's very difficult work, and we can sympathize with that. I definitely do. Actually, it's funny to notice that at the same time, the police is launching mass protests in France on the 5th of December, which is going to have a nationwide impact. So they will use the police against you. They will use police brutality. They're going to harm you with tear gas, with rubber bullets, with every tactic in the book. You name it, they have it. If it doesn't work, they're going to fine you, expecting you not to be able to pay. And after that, well, you just have to forget the fact that you're a free citizen. You can just stay home and protest from your keyboard. And of course, if they take you too many times, I had friends of mine, comrades of mine, who were denied the right to go to a demonstration by the police, despite the fact that they have done nothing wrong. Actually, one of my very good friend, and Yellow Vest, was denied the right to go to these protests, despite the fact that he's a veteran, who fought for France. He has good ties with the police. He always sympathized with them, never threw a rock against them, never threw anything against them, never threw a fit. He doesn't have the right anymore. He was fined by the police, and he doesn't have the right anymore to participate in those demonstrations.
Okay, so look, whereabouts do you think these demonstrations are heading? Now we're a year into them. What for the next months? Do you think there's going to be some achievements and change, or do you think maybe the tactics are going to work and the French people are going to give up trying to get rid of Macron?
Unfortunately, of course, it would take a very wise man to see what's coming next, which I'm not that wise. But I think, unfortunately, these tactics, they tend to be very efficient. And we can see that despite the fact that the massive amounts, the majority of French people really sympathize with the movement, and you can see that as a Yellow Vest, when you wear the Yellow Vest, you get all sorts of comments from the people who don't go to the demonstrations, and they are really supportive of that. Despite that, most people are frightened by the amount of violence that they see, of course, during those demonstrations. You have to take into account the fact that going to these demonstrations, you were talking before about the number of people who were killed within, during these demonstrations. You have to talk about the awful amounts of people who lost an eye, who lost an arm, who lost a hand, who became completely handicapped due to police violence. And of course, not many people are willing to go to these demonstrations if it means, that it doesn't achieve anything, because Emmanuel Macron has done nothing to answer the people's call, of course, for more than a year now, and he's not going to do anything. I don't see why he should. It doesn't fit with his personality. So many people are afraid. Many people are losing hope. Many people are afraid of getting fined as well. They are afraid of getting in trouble with the police. I've had one instance, also one of my friends who's a bit of who's an older gentleman. He needs to take care of his father, and he was just informed 2 days ago that he was going to lose the custody of his father, which is handicapped and very old, because of his participation with this protest and because of the fact that he was arrested by the police.
So it sounds to me like Macron has nearly won.
Macron, I don't think that the end of the Yellow Vests, and we shouldn't talk about the end of the Yellow Vests just right now. I think there's part of this movement that, due to the severe tactics, due to this severe police brutality, has hardened. And most of them are not willing to let go of this movement. And even though, the Yellow Vest might come to an end, and it might, let's face it, we have country of protest, and I don't see any improvement into the daily living conditions of the French people. I think that the revolt might come to a halt, but it's going to come back eventually, and it's going to come back even stronger, especially regarding what happened to the Yellow Vest.
Okay, well, what about the police? You say they're doing a demonstration soon. Might that make a difference?
So not only that, you have the police, you have hospitals, you have teachers, you have transport, people working transportation, meaning everyone, in France, especially in the, civil servants, they oppose Macron. They want to, actually. The thing is, it is very different from these Yellow Vest protests, because these protests are staged by the workers' union, which most of them, they work with Macron. They thrive from the EU's help. They thrive from government aid and from government help. So I don't think there's a sincere will in these workers' unions elites to overthrow the government or to change the situation in any way. they thrive on that. I hope that most, people who are members of these organizations, they can see that workers' union are not an alternative. They are part of a system, and I hope that most of them will rejoin the Yellow Vest and that, or a different sort of protest in line with the demands of the Yellow Vest.
Doesn't it? It does sound to me as if maybe those protests are moving a bit closer to Macron, and that may make a difference.
Of course, we all started out, me included, as beginners in a way, if there's such a thing in politics. We all started out because of disbelief, because of frustration, because of poverty, because of daily difficulties, and the fact that we saw that the government and previous governments as well have nothing to do with it, and they don't want to improve the situation. So we started out 1 year ago with no experience whatsoever, in running a demonstration, in running a protest, in communication. We don't have, and of course, the French medias, the French news sources are not here to help. And that's why I'm thankful that independents such as yourself, they get the job done. And of course, throughout this year, we acquired several tactics, a bit of more knowledge, and we improved regarding our status as what we can only be seen as, political fighters, because that's what we are, unfortunately. We saw that elections did nothing to change. We saw that so-called elected political power, like Macron is supposed to be, is not going to change anything, that he follows the EU's policy. And so we have to take care of things. We have to take this matter with our own hands, basically. We have to take care of this matter. And I think most of us have acquired specific skills and experience that we didn't have a year ago. So that's why I'm very hopeful that eventually we're going to win. I'm very hopeful that these governments will go away and that these EU's puppets and financial puppets will finally manage to get rid of them, because they have been plaguing not only France's economy, but the French society for way longer than expected. And we need to get rid of them if we want to survive as a nation, if we want to survive as a people, because it's only going to get worse.
Okay, Thibault, thanks very much for joining us.
Well, thank you so much.
You're listening to dialectradio.co.uk, your local community radio run by volunteers. Log on to our website at dialectradio.co.uk to find out more.